What President Zelensky and the Ukrainian armed forces are going to do is to strike back very cleverly at targets like the Wildberries things, which has a direct effect. You know, if you're looking for that parcel to arrive and it doesn't arrive because a depot has been blown up, then that starts to affect the way you think about life. The real challenge, I think, though, is does Putin actually care? I mean, this is a man who has basically presided over upwards of 1.5 million casualties, who is prepared to mortgage for the future of his economy in order to pursue his aggressions. He is contemplating a mobilisation of up to 300,000 people this September. That shows that he is not willing to give up and is not really interested in talking. We don't know a huge amount how Ozon is used within the Russian system. We do know that they are major logistics hubs, and in the past have been regarded as primarily for kind of retail and for civilian use. However, a huge amount of material that's required to sustain the war in Russia is effectively dual use, whether it be food, electronics, and so forth. So it may well be there's a military target aspect to it as well. More importantly, I think, and this is really why it's been struck, is because it cuts to the heart of the kind of psychological challenge to the Russian people that Zelensky has now thrown down. Because we saw until relatively recently, we saw pictures, for example, of Russian families taking holidays in the Crimea, in the Black Sea. In other words, as though there was a war going on, 300 kilometers to their west, but nothing else was going on. And I think the sense that Putin's tried to put across to the Russian people that the war was somebody else's business, this was a special military operation. I think Zelensky felt he needed to kind of break that kind of psychological message, that narrative, if you like. And so we've seen a series of attacks now, which actually are designed not just for their military value, and in terms of actually how they affect the war, but also kind of psychological effect. A good example are some of the attacks on the oil refineries, which not only have a direct effect on Russia's ability to process its oil and therefore creates fuel shortages in some parts of Russia, but they produce these huge plumes of smoke into the air, which absolutely can be seen from literally hundreds of miles around, which will give an indication to the Russian people that all is not well. So I see those attacks on the Ozon logistic hubs as part of that. And of course, it's also a direct response to the Russian double tap attack on the shopping centre in President Zelensky's hometown, and the Ukrainian attacks on the Wildberries, which are very much like the kind of Amazon warehouses we see in our country. Almost any aspect of kind of infrastructure, whether it be bridges, whether it be railways, warehouses, and everything that goes with that, of course, they are effectively dual use. They're used to move civilian items around the place, but they're also legitimate military targets because they're also used to move military equipment and supplies around. We've seen that particularly in the area around the Crimea and in the southern part of the battlefield in Ukraine, where there's been a very clear attempt to try and isolate Crimea and isolate the Russian forces, but also having the effect of isolating the Russian population in those areas, who have reported fuel shortages and so forth. So yeah, I think it's part of that same thing. Attacks on infrastructure always have this kind of double-edged sword element to them. The real challenge, I think, though, is does Putin actually care? I mean, this is a man who has basically presided over upwards of 1.5 million casualties, and we know a good high percentage of those, maybe 50% of those, are dead. Who is prepared to mortgage for the future of his economy in order to pursue his aggressions. And I think the reality is that because he's also immune from the kind of pressures that attacks on such warehouses will do, that he in most cases won't care. Now, it's not to say that in the future there might be opposition that arises which says we can't continue this and keep it going. But he's so organised his economy that it can keep going as a wartime economy probably for 2 to 3 years. What that does mean is that when the crash finally happens, the crash will be harder than before. But like I said, it's essentially he's mortgaging the future of Russia's economy in order to keep his war going.
Киевский режим поставил своей целью нанести ущерб нашей экономике. Что он сделал? Он сам открыл этот ящик Пандоры. Ну что ж, получите ответ по вашим наиболее чувствительным отраслям экономики, которые, честно говоря, и так дышат на ладан.
The Russian attitude is always to react very aggressively with high levels of rhetoric when something happens that they don't like doing. It's worth recalling and worth noting that he has been consistently attacking residential and pure civilian targets throughout the length and breadth of Ukraine now for a long time, with no real pretense at their military targets. It's just simply they can hit them, therefore they do. So they've been engaging this kind of warfare from there. What President Zelensky and the Ukrainian Armed Forces do is to strike back very cleverly at targets like the Wildberries things, which has a direct effect. If you're looking for that parcel to arrive and doesn't arrive because a depot has been blown up, then that starts to affect the way you think about life. So they're very clever psychological targets from there. And I think Putin's response and the violence of his response indicates he recognises there's a weakness there, which has been exploited from there. I think the really interesting thing is where Putin goes next. And I don't think it's necessarily just in the realm of targets or targeting. There's some quite interesting source reporting suggesting that he is contemplating a mobilisation of up to 300,000 people this September. It may seem extraordinary, but up until now, very largely, they've been able to rely on volunteers. Now, occasionally they've had to kind of scrape around to find the volunteers. They've emptied their prisons. They've given huge amounts of kind of bribery or incentive money to people to come along and fight and join in the fight. But they haven't actually mobilised and reintroduced conscription to do this. The suggestion is that he's looking to mobilise some 300,000 people this September, which if that happens, and then there'll be a period of training for them, that would suggest that he thinks there's at least one more viable, if you like, roll of the dice to take place, which would probably be, if this doesn't come across, it would probably be in the spring of next year. Nothing is absolutely certain, but even if you mobilise people, you can't throw them straight into the front line. And so there'll be a period of training in an organisation to do that. Now that seems to me, if that happens, that shows that he is not willing to give up and is not really interested in talking, and believes he can keep this going for a long period of time. So I think that's I think this is, if you like, exchange of destruction of retail sites will continue. And what Putin is trying to do is destabilize Ukraine at a period when Ukraine itself is also politically is in more turmoil than it has been for a while. But I think the really big issue in terms of the operational level challenges will be whether or not Putin actually orders the mobilization that's been talked about for September or not. Whilst he's been able to take some 20% of the territory, there are still quite a lot of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions that are still remain in Ukrainian hands, including, and this is the key thing, including the areas which have their major defensive positions. What the Ukrainians have done is constructed significant numbers of what you might call field fortifications, which are lines of defences that go across the countryside. In some areas stronger than others, but they're nonetheless very impressive. And if Putin was able to capture those, then effectively the rest of Ukraine would then be bereft of any major defences, because the emphasis has been on building these defences up. So for him, when he talks rather grandly about, I just want the rest of these two provinces to make sure they're whole, he's not really just, he's been disingenuous, because what he reads after is the defences and the defensive areas within the Donbas region, which Ukrainians still hold. So that might well be the target that he is seeking.